Just to let you know, we're going to split this roughly into three. We're going to talk first a bit about how you might use Flow to guide data entry or to validate data entry. Gaurav's going to talk a bit about that. Then we're going to talk a bit about how you could use Flow to update records that you, in a way that you can't do just with workflow rules or process builder. It's kind of Flow in combination with other automation. Allison's going to guide us through that. And then Aiden is going to talk about how you can use Flow to mass create some records. As usual, if you have questions, please post them in the chat as we're going along. And also, since there are lots of you on the call, please will you mute your mic unless you're the person who's talking. Usually in these sessions, we don't have much time to sort of call on other people to talk. So if you could all mute your mics, please, that would be great. Laurel has already asked if there's going to be an opportunity to troubleshoot Flow problems. Yes, I hope so, Laurel, and I hope that, as I say, our panelists have prepared some demos, but if you have real life examples that need some help and some talking through, yes, we will definitely try and make some time for that. So it would be great, Laurel, if you wouldn't mind just putting a brief description of what you're trying to troubleshoot, and then we'll know how to fit it into as we go along. So I think that's quite enough for me. And Gorav, would you like to get us going?
That sounds great. So hello everybody, I'm Gorav Seth. I love flows. I've talked about them here and there at the user group, but I've used them for a number of years, and so I wanted to kind of demo a couple of the ones I've used and kind of talk about why I've used them. And specifically, kind of, I'll be talking about this section will be about how to use Flow to kind of guide and validate data entry. And so one of the first things, I think this is actually the first flow I built, was, Ashoka's, I work at Ashoka, I'm the prime admin here, and our instance predates the iPhone. It's been around, we're on NA2, we've been around for a long time, and we have a lot of fields. And now I am going to share my screen. So if I was to add a new contact, without using visual workflow, you can imagine people might find it a little daunting. No, I'm not at the bottom yet, and then after you save, of course, you get all the related lists as well. But we have a lot of fields. We have actually simplified it somewhat, but what I wanted to do was make a simple way for people to create contacts. And so I built a flow. And over time, the flow evolved. It's now on version 38, so it looks for duplicates and does some fun stuff. But at its heart, it's just it's a much nicer interface for creating a contact. Now, I just enabled what's called the lightning runtime for flows, and I mean just like 15 minutes ago. So it actually looks much nicer now. But you can see that, and you can actually have two columns, which I haven't leveraged yet. But you can see how all of a sudden we can just get the and of course, let me know if you can't see or if I'm going too fast. But you can enter the person's name. I'll just enter myself, my address at ashoka.org, and we can enter the address. And the country, we're not using state country pick list, so we'll call it USA. And we have a validation rule there. And so I can present some information to the user saying, hey, country is required if any of the address fields are populated, because we have a validation rule for that. Please search for duplicates prior to creating a new contact. But it allows me to both show less information, just capture the relevant information, and I have to remember exactly how to trigger it. I think if I don't include this info, but try and include the other info, I might just have built something that'll tell me that I did something wrong, but we'll see. Either way, it's just it's a nice, oh, I guess I was allowed to do that. And then at the end of the flow, I present a link to the contact record. One thing about flows, it's a little tricky to direct people back to a record they created in the flow. It is possible, but it requires a little bit of code for now. So this is how I typically do it. And so then they click on the link, and there's the contact I just created. And now they can see it in its full glory with all of the fields and the related lists. So it's a simple example, but it kind of shows what flows let you do. And this is just one screen. You can walk people through multiple screens. You can create wizards and decision supports and triage systems. And it lets you do all of this essentially without code. It's not the most intuitive interface that you'll ever see, but it is graphical. It lets you stretch what you can do a long way. I'll briefly show what the underlying flow looks like. It's, like I said, this isn't version 1. It was much simpler at first, but I've got some validation. The screen that you saw is right here. And if everything goes according to plan, then it creates the record, it creates the contact. So this screen is literally what you were just looking at. First name, last name, all that stuff. But then I've got some decisions to see if the address is populated right, if country is populated right, if there's an email and is there a matching. So I get to walk through a lot of stuff, and if I find a match on email, then I can show them the match. I actually can show them all of the possible matches. This is called a dynamic choice. And so if there were 5 contacts that had that email address, all 5 of them would be here. It's not the most beautiful interface. It'll just show their name. But then they can select one of them and see the details about that contact. And I can present them additional options. So this is, in the end, well, all we did in this flow was I entered the information, and then it created the one-to-one org, it created the contact, and popped me up at this screen that said, hey, you've created your record. So that's kind of a quick overview of one thing you can do with flows. One other thing I was going to show is, unless there's any questions about that, let me just pause for a second. I think I see someone saying I'm quiet. Can you guys hear me okay? I can try and change that if not. I'll assume it's okay.
I think you're doing okay. I think the volume is all right, provided you don't get any quieter, Gorav.
Okay, I can get a little louder.
And there are some questions, but not related to what you've been talking about. So, so please go ahead. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Okay, actually, there is a question just related to what you were doing. Tell us a little bit more about this flow designer. So you've got these kind of the screens, and you've got decisions and various things like that. And then John has asked if you could allow a second household member.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd have to think about exactly how I would do that, but basically, you can essentially you can put in a loop. You could put not a checkbox, a radio button for, do you want to add another member? And if so, you could basically present the screen, capture more information. It's a little bit of a different design. It would use what's called an S-object collection, but I could demo that. I could build something in demo like that you could load and as a kind of proof of concept that you could see. But yeah, it could very much you would be able to do that. It's one of the powerful things about flows is it lets you work with multiple records in various ways, and I think we're gonna touch on that more a little bit later. But is it possible? Absolutely. And so I was saying, there's a lot of elements in here because I was kind of figuring out all the different fun things I could do with flows. But the main elements is a screen element where you capture information from the submitter. Decision elements are just what they sound. They're logical elements. Is this equal to X? Then go down this path. If it equals Y, go down that path. And you can have n number of paths. So they can be pretty cool, and you can use them in some pretty crafty ways. And for example, in this case, if it's if something is not entered correctly, you can route them back to where they came from, and with a different with an error message that says, hey, you need to do this differently. And on screens, you have validation rules, basically the same as you do in on Salesforce. So you can create, the flow will require your validation rules, but it won't display them in a very nice way. It'll just basically tell you that the flow failed. So you want to, if you have validation rules on the object that can fail, you kind of need to build those into your flow as well. So in this example, this is I don't think they actually offer an email field type. I don't remember actually doing this, but we must have been getting errors on this flow because people were entering bad email addresses. So somewhere on the internet, I found a regular expression that more or less validates email addresses. That's surprisingly tricky to do, I believe, but this has worked. So I added my own validation rule so that otherwise, when the user submitted the flow, it would just trigger, it would basically blow up in their face. So that is something that you will want to do, is make sure that to the extent possible that users won't hit any validation rules downstream that will cause the flow to blow up in their face. So I think, like the screen, you've got different types of fields, and you can do some pretty cool stuff, and you can go from one screen to the next screen, and you can have a decision element that routes them to one screen if they say yes, and another screen if they say no. And there's a pilot going on in this release that you can actually have conditional fields in a flow. So if it equals yes, you don't just have to, they don't have to click next. You can actually then display additional fields, versus if it's no, then you can display other fields. So if that comes out, that'll be very helpful as well. But right now in this flow, I'm basically using three types of elements, like screens, decisions, and kind of record lookups and creates. So 4 types of elements. And there is very good documentation on this. It's all moved into Trailhead now, but there's some very good trails, and there's a lot of blog posts. Like people who use flows like to write blog posts because there's a lot of confusing stuff that happens, and kind of tricks to get around various issues you might face. So I think with that, maybe I'll move to the next flow, but I'll just that is actually it's very relevant for people who are looking to move to Lightning. If you've got any JavaScript buttons in your instance, you might be able to replace them with flows. And we had a button that I've replaced it with a flow, but it basically looked to see that the data was entered properly, and if so, updated the record, updated the submitted field to yes. And in order, I wanted to shut it off for other reasons, for what's called API client whitelisting, which I'll wax on about some other time, but something I'm a big fan of. But basically, I had to get rid of those JavaScript buttons, and I was able to replace it with a flow. And what this flow does is it does this exact same thing the button does. It says, have you entered the data in this thing yet correctly? And if so, there's not actually an approval process. It actually just updates this field, but you could actually submit the record into an approval process, and I have other flows that do that. So when I hit submit, I believe, if all goes well, it'll tell me that, hey, look, you didn't do this right. In order to submit, and it actually does it much nicer than it would. The JavaScript button pulls up one of those little windows at the top of the page. Sorry, that's kind of like you did something wrong. Where here I can present it in a nice manner, and I can let them actually fill out the fields that they messed up. So I can say, okay, no, you had to set beginning date to that and end date to that, and that field is required. And now you click next, and it still blew up. And that was intentional, because there's a ton of complicated validation rules on this, and I was like, I don't want to try and rebuild all of those in the flow. Because it's pretty ugly. And so what I did, and I can show the flow, but I used what's called the fault path. So if there's an error, you can actually, instead of just having it blow up, you can direct them to a screen. And so what I did, I decided, instead of trying to rebuild all those validation rules, I was just going to say, if it fails the update, I'm going to direct them to a screen, and this said, this is likely why the error is happening. And indeed, that is correct. So if I click finish, I'm going to lose those 3 things. Oh no, I actually didn't fix that. So it actually preserves the updates that I made. And what I didn't do is I didn't enter one of these to requesting funds. So come on. There we go. So I'll move that to requesting funds. And now when I click submit, it'll just go ahead and update it because there's nothing left, and boom, it's done. So I can show the flow really quickly, and I'll show that fault path, and I think that'll probably be the last thing I do. So here we go, and this is called. One important thing with flows is use a naming convention, because there's no way to sort them like you can with workflows and everything. So if you can, start with the object, otherwise you'll have a hard time finding them. The flow designer actually runs in Flash, so it can be a little clunky, or more than a little clunky, but more often than not it works. And what happened here was here it is, the fault. So I basically get the record that I'm working with. I decide if it has any issues. If it does, I display it. I say, hey, you need to do X, Y, or Z. And then I update the record. And then I try and submit it, and I update the record again. And if that record fails, I want to show this screen. And that's the one that we saw, which said, hey, there was an error. This is likely why. Click finish to return the request, and you can review, update, and resubmit. So I think it's an example of not only that you can present, give people the information they need to do it right. You can actually present the fields that they actually need to update to do it right. And then it's also an example. I can show you. Let me see if I can find these validation rules. Maybe they're not as ugly as I remember them, but I think there were a lot of them. I'm not gonna worry about it. But anyways, it gives you an opportunity to, if there's an error, you can actually display a friendly error message versus the, this thing blew up on you message.
Which is great, because that's there are quite a lot of questions around that, and people are definitely liking this nice friendly screen. And Allison had also suggested that that one of the other things you could do on a fault is send an email to an admin
Yes,
as well,
definitely.
which is another way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
There was so one of the things that I'm interested in is how you kind of get to that first screen, in the first place, either when you were with the button or when you were doing the quick create. Is it just enough to build the flow, or do you need something else as well that's going to actually launch it?
So it depends on what type of flow you're using, but you typically need something to launch it. You can launch it from a button, or you can launch it from Process Builder. Those are basically your two options. If your flow, it's a little detailed, but if your flow has screens where it's presenting information to the user, you can't launch it from Process Builder. You can't launch it automatically. And B, it runs with the permissions of the user, right? So if a user doesn't have access to a field, you can't display it to them in a flow, because any flow that has screens runs with the permissions of the user. I'm hoping they make that optional at some point, but right now that is mandatory. So in my case, I have a custom button, the submit button, that launches the flow. And on the flow itself, if I close this, they make it pretty easy for you. They give you the URL. So you literally can copy that URL into a button, which is exactly what I have done. I can't imagine I did anything else. So here's the submit button, and there it is. And what you'll see, what I'm doing here, there is one additional step, which is for the flow to know which record you're working on. You have to pass that record's ID into the flow, or you can basically pass variables into the flow through the URL. And you would, if you launch it from Process Builder gives you a nice little interface for mapping variables into the flow. But basically, this is the ID of the record I'm working on. And here I'm setting the return URL, which is where you want to go once the flow is done. And that is pretty common with almost any flows. You would pass in an ID and pass in the return URL. Now with the quick create contact flow, I'm not working on any existing records. So I'm actually passing in the running user ID. I can't remember why. I probably want to display their name somewhere. But if it's a flow that's just creating a new record, you literally can just essentially copy and paste this this URL. Like, so if I, in the quick create contact flow, if I just take this URL and, you know, put it right here, it will launch the flow because it doesn't need any existing data to run. Whereas the cache request flow, because I need to know which record I'm working on, I actually pass in the record ID to what's called a flow variable. And if you give me a sec, I can probably even show you what that is. And that's probably one of the most common issues people have with flows is that the variable needs to be set to input, to allow input. By default, they're private variables, which means nothing outside of the flow can interact with them. So if I'm not going to go into an in-depth detail of the different how you navigate flows, but here's my variable. It's called variable cache request ID. It is case sensitive, so make sure the URL matches exactly the variable. And you can see how I've marked it as input only. The default is private. You have to mark it as at least input only in order to be able to pass something in. So that's a very common. Any flow I have will have a, typically have a variable like that. That's where everything starts from.
That's great. Thank you. As somebody's been asking about launching Flow from Process Builder, and Allison's going to come on to that in a minute. I'm just looking to see if there were any specific questions. There was one about Gorav, when you're doing your record matching, is the Flow doing its own matching? Can you use it alongside the duplicate management from the data.com duplicate management, native duplicate management?
I don't have that enabled yet, so I'm not sure. If anyone else on the call has the answer and how it plays with dupe management, I'd love to know. I am just literally matching on email only, so I've got what's called a dynamic choice, which shows you all matching records based on certain criteria. And in this case, it's just basically showing all contacts that have that email. If it does play with duplicate management, that would be really nice. I imagine with this new Lightning runtime that's possible, but I don't know the answer to that. I will look into it.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much. And then there's also a question about how you kind of share flows with other people, and maybe we'll try and pick that skills question. Maybe we'll try and pick that up in chat. Let's move on. Allison, do you want to tell us a bit more about how you use flows?
Sure. So I am going to demo a flow that I haven't actually needed to use in production. I've needed to use something similar. I just switched jobs, so my my old org has the stuff that I was building. So sorry, I'm looking on the screen. So the flow that I'm going to show is kind of a helper for getting acknowledgements set up, and like gift acknowledgements, and also for setting primary campaign source. The idea behind this, and this is a dev org, but the idea behind this is you have a job, like a charge code, which has two parts, a job and an account. And combined, these two create acknowledgement text. And there are also some situations where the charge account would create the primary campaign source. So for this flow, first I'm launching it from Process Builder. It's always happening anytime an opportunity is created or edited. When the charge code isn't blank. So it needs both a job and an account. If I had been doing this in production, I also would have checked this. Yes, it's only when the specified changes are made to the record. And then I'm going to launch the flow by immediately, I'm going to launch the flow by setting the flow variable. So I have a variable that's opportunity ID, and I set that as a reference to the opportunity that created this process, or that started this process, and I'm just getting the ID of that field. So then I come into my flow, and first step is grab that same opportunity. And so I'm just looking for an opportunity that has the same ID as the variable that was just set when I launched the flow. And when I go in, I'm going to create, and I usually use SObjects. That's just my, like, I started working with flows when I needed an SObject, so now I'm really used to it. I think there are definitely reasons not to. But so I'm going to save the ID, the job, the charge account, the acknowledgement text field, and the campaign ID. And that's going to kind of hold on to all the pieces that I want to adjust as part of this flow. So then basically I wanted to say, if it's an unrestricted annual fund gift, then it's going to, the acknowledgement is going to need to say, thank you for supporting all of ACF's programs and services. It's just the really, really generic. If it's restricted annual fund, so the job is something other than development, but the charge account is still annual fund, then I'm going to want it to talk about which job it was. So I have some other pick list options in here that I would be able to choose from. So it would say, thank you for supporting overhead. That would be nice. Thank you for supporting conferences. Thank you for supporting bookstore. And then special project is what happens if it's neither of those, if it's something outside of the annual fund. So then I have a few nifty variables, or a few nifty formulas. So my job, I need to be able to, finance knows this first part of the code. They know the numbers, and fundraising staff knows what the words are. So finance cares about 07, and development cares about the conferences part. So I need to be able to display both within this job field. But then when I'm setting the acknowledgement text, I don't care about the finance piece. I just care about the end of it. So I just grabbed the part after the numbers. And so that's the job text. For the account charge code, I did the same basic thing. I grabbed the part after the numbers, and then I have one additional field here, which is just really, I mean, it could be almost the same. And then the account text. And the reason that I did that is for special projects, I want it to say something like, thank you for supporting the Bicycles Fund, instead of just thank you for supporting Bicycles Fund. And then we get into this special project thing. So if it's assigned to a special project and there's an empty campaign source, then I want to see if I can find a campaign that'll match it. So we had something where there was a hospitality suite, and we were trying to raise money for this hospitality suite. And so anytime we hadn't already specified the primary campaign source for an opportunity that had a chart account of the hospitality suite fund, it would go into hospitality suite fund. So see, now we have this great, the primary campaign source is updated, and the acknowledgement text is also updated. So the way that I went through and did that, I looked at the campaign source. If it was empty, then I went through and did this lookup, and if it was populated, then I just skipped it. So this decision is just skipping right down to the next step. If it was empty, I looked for a campaign where it was active and where the name contained the account text. And all I needed to save in there was the ID, because I'm not really dealing with anything other than just loading that ID into the opportunity. And then I did want to do another step. If there weren't any matches for that campaign, if they didn't find anything, then I'm going to load in the default special projects campaign. And if there was a match, then I assign the primary campaign source to that campaign ID that I just looked up. And regardless of what happens over here, kind of all of these steps end with me updating the opportunity. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting. So you're going down all these kind of little mazes, and there are a lot of decisions. How, when you're doing a flow like this, I mean, how do you sort of plan it? Or do you just launch in with the flow designer and keep making versions until you get it right?
I usually map it out using like Glyphy, or using even just a pen and paper, and kind of go through and develop my own little flowchart. Sometimes there will be a spreadsheet or something like, if this happens, then this. And if I was really being careful about it, I could create separate flows for each little piece of the process. So yeah, but it's usually just kind of pen and paper, doing a flow chart, figuring out what it was that I wanted.
I think it really helps, doesn't it? Because the trouble is, once you get into the flow designer, you can get quite sort of preoccupied with whether this variable's right, or whether you've remembered to reference that, or whatever, isn't it? It sort of helps to have a kind of overall kind of scheme, or know what direction you're going in, I think, before you kind of get down in the weeds. There's a couple, yeah. So there's an Laurel's picked up on your looking up the primary campaign source, and which is, I think, is an interesting question.
Select the most recent.
Yeah.
How would you select the most recent active campaign that fit the criteria? Yeah, so that's actually what I did in this. Well, define most recent, right? So if you can find a date field that gives you what you're calling most recent, so whether that's the latest start date, or the latest end date, or the last modified date. For this, I picked the last modified date, and I just sorted the results by descending. And because this is an S object, not an S object collection, it's going to select the first one. And then I'm going to have, the sort order. So Laurel, it looks like that answered your question.
That's super helpful, she says, yes.
Great.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, you could also have something a little more specific. I know I've used sort of additional checkboxes for campaigns that may be open for registration, or something like that, which you can use. Yeah, that's great. sorry to kind of interrupt you again, Alison, but perhaps you could speak a little to, there's another question here from John. Can you summarize when lightning process won't be able to do the job and you do need a flow?
So there are a couple of instances where I automatically go to flow. One of them is if you're going to need to delete anything, Process Builder won't do it. Another is if you end up with this kind of like not just one branching, but like branching a couple of times, then you're probably going to end up wanting to use flow eventually. Those are the big.
Yeah, because you've got, like, this one has all these kinds of decisions, isn't it? There's all sorts of different criteria, and it would be, yeah, it would be a pretty complex process, probably even a rather impossible one, I think, to take account of all those different things that you've got.
Right. Also, if you're working with formulas that don't already exist.
Yes, that's a good one.
Like as a field, if you have the fields all set up and you're just trying to like put them together or pick one, then you're fine in Process Builder. But if you want to create formulas kind of on the fly, then you're going to probably want to use Flow.
Any other thoughts, rest of the panel? I mean, I think there are things you can do. You know, in Flow, you can sometimes relate objects which aren't so kind of obviously related. So you can kind of, it's a more distinct or a kind of distant relationship across several objects, I think. Flow gives you a bit more flexibility for that. And yeah, Aiden suggested about the bulk operations.
And John, I'm seeing your question about formulas on the fly. Really, all I'm talking about is like these kinds of formulas that really, I don't need to store like account text or the plus the account text in my opportunity record. I just don't need to, like, that's not those aren't fields that are going to be useful to me in other circumstances. So this way I get to kind of work with this formula and then just leave it here. And Gorav has some additional reasons to use Flow in the chat, which include more control, referencing custom settings and custom metadata, delete, better control over error handling, and better visibility in weight elements. I totally agree. One thing that I, just while I'm presenting, and then I will give up control, one thing that I really like doing is using the post to chatter and send email for error handling, and also just kind of for debugging while I'm going through. So like often in early versions of my Flow, I will send an email kind of anytime it does anything. In between steps, I'll say, get opportunity, then send an email saying, I got the opportunity, just to me, so that I know that it worked and so that I know which step, how steps went. And posting to chatter also can be a useful kind of debugging tool. Posting to chatter can also be really helpful. I saw a question from John earlier about how would an admin later know that functionality that's not standard was like happened because of a flow. And that's often where I would put in a chatter post saying, like for this one, the like here at the end, I would put in a message saying the acknowledgement text for this opportunity was set automatically via a flow or via the set acknowledgement text flow. If it's not working as expected, please contact an admin. And that would just live in the chatter feed for the record. So it's not super complicated, but it will kind of give everyone a little bit of an indication of what's going on. You could theoretically put in like a topic for it as well, anytime a flow was doing something.
That's a nice trick. And I was, and just going back to that question about things that Flow can do that Process Builder can't, it strikes me there's also a whole load of stuff around lookups, isn't there? I mean, the way you have, we talked about this idea of how you would find a campaign. I mean, that's not something you could do within Process Builder, is it? I mean, to actually go and find the campaign that is referenced in certain ways. So yeah. Great. Can you just click back to your process, Allison? Let's just have another quick refresher look at how you started this going. So you'd set your.
I'm going to clone it so that we can just like click into things.
Yeah, sure.
So I started by selecting the opportunity, and I just said anytime the record is created or edited. We're not going to be evaluating this multiple times. And then I wanted it to work anytime both the job and the charge account were filled in. That was the starting point for my flow. And then I set the acknowledgement text. So here, I can easily do this for you. So I click Add Action, then Flows, then Action Name, Set Acknowledgement Text. And then I'm going to find an auto-launched flow, which is Set Acknowledgement Text. Something to know about this is it's only going to work on auto-launched flows, and it's only going to work on active flows. So make sure if you're not seeing the flow that you want, it might not be active. That's often been my problem. So I click Set Acknowledgement Text, and then I set the flow variables. The only variable that I actually have to be set in this flow is this opportunity ID. But if I had more variables than this, I would be able to select as many as I wanted. So click on the variable, then the reference, and then I get this opportunity, and I'm just going to select the ID. That's pretty much, and then I save it. And that's really it. And then obviously activate it.
It's great. That's great because it's interesting. Yeah, so it's you're using the process to select which of the records, kind of narrow down which of the records, aren't you? Mm-hmm. And then all you're really doing is just saying, okay, Flow, here's your opportunity, get going. That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, brilliant. Let's move on to Aiden. And if anyone else has any other questions, please put them in chat. Aiden, are you there?
Yes, I am. Just trying to share my screen.
Okay. There we go.
Okay, so you can see the loan campaigns and members. Mm-hmm. Which means you're looking at the wrong page.
Yes, we're looking at your fancy slides.
Okay. So now you should see my campaign list. Or are you?
We're still looking at. Yes, I think so. We're looking at a PowerPoint with a fast lookup.
Oh, wrong page. The dangers of multiple monitors.
Ah, now we've got you. Okay.
Okay, here we go. So what we find sometimes is that clients want to be able to mass create or clone a parent record and the child records underneath it. It could be something like a opportunity with payments, a account with contacts, a class with attendees, really anything. But hi, Mark. So I have, in this situation, I'm going to, I've set up a flow to clone a campaign. It's called Save the Puffins, and it's dated for May of 2017. And I have 22 campaign members associated to it. So I need to, I can use a standard clone button from Salesforce, but it's only going to clone the campaign record. It won't clone all of the campaign members. And I don't want to have to manually reassign all of those campaign members. So again, this could be something like a volunteer campaign with volunteers that are associated to it. But either way, I have a button here that I've called Deep Clone, and I could be using this by just a checkbox on the record itself. And when I deep clone, this is going to bring me back to my campaigns tab. And now I'm going to see a new record called Save the Puffins June 2017. I have my 22 campaign members, and I have my details set up, and I was able to set certain parameters with my flow of this is an active campaign. It's got a start date of this month, ending this month. And if I were to look at my May record, it would have had a May 1st start date and a May 31st end date, and any other records. So the standard clone will do some of that for me. I'd have to manually reset some values, and I'd have to recreate, you know, my 22 contacts, but the deep clone does that for me. So if we want to know what this looks like, in the actual flow that I've created, one of the first things that I always do is I create an assignment record that's going to hold a hard-coded parent ID, whether it's a campaign ID, account ID, whatever. It's the 18-digit ID. And this allows me to test this flow from the flow without actually having to go back to the record in the regular UI and click a button or click a checkbox. I just put it here, and then I make the assignment the start element while I'm testing. So I don't actually have to leave here when I'm doing my testing. So I'm doing a fast lookup on my campaign. So again, just like Allison was showing, I'm looking up my campaign, I'm looking up the ID, and this is the campaign ID I'm passing, and it's the S-object variable. So an S-object variable is one record. That's all you're going to get with an S-object variable. And I'm pulling back, you know, the campaign name, the start and end date, the type, a record type, and whether it was active or not. I always do a decision after I do a fast lookup to make sure that I actually found what I was looking for. Maybe for some reason, I don't find that campaign. And if I don't, then I want my flow to stop. Otherwise, it's going to throw an error. So I always do it. And there's a couple of ways of deciding whether or not a lookup was actually successful. But one of the ways is you can actually just reference the lookup and say whether it was true. And if you do that, that's one way for Salesforce to say that it actually found something. I could also just say whether the SOV campaign was null or not, but I like this method. If the campaign was true, then if I found my campaign, then I create a new one. And so I have a formula in here that's going to determine my start and end dates, and I'm passing the other values from the original campaign into the new campaign record that I'm finding. And then I return a variable for my new campaign. Then I do a lookup. I do a lookup to a fast lookup. So the fast lookup allows me to get a collection or a temporary table of multiple records versus a regular lookup, which only will pull back one record. So a fast lookup then, and now I'm looking for the campaign members that had the original, that were associated to the original campaign ID. And in this particular case, again, so this is an S object collection, again, a temporary table that will hold all of the records that I found, whether it's one record or two records. And I pull back and I need the campaign ID, and I need the contact ID, and I need the existing status. Again, after a lookup, I do a decision. Maybe I didn't find any campaign members. If I didn't, then I'm going to stop. If I don't, then I'm going to keep going. Because if you don't do this decision and then you try to loop through a campaign, you're going to get an error because there's nothing to loop through. So the loop basically just tells Salesforce to start working one record at a time through that through the S object collection, the temporary table. And what happens, you'll always see two assignments. As I loop through, so if you imagine the loop is a temporary table with all of my 22 campaign members that we found, the next element is I'm passing that through the loop. I'm taking one record at a time, and I'm updating, and I'm creating new information one record at a time with the first assignment. Okay, so I have a new S object variable for a new campaign member that I'm going to create. And then as I go through that, I take that one record and then I pass it to a new temporary table. So this is an S object collection. So this is a new temporary table that I'm going to be working with. And once I'm finished with that, I go back to the loop and say, well, now that I've worked through all 22 records in my temporary table, what do I do now? Then I use a fast create to create all of those new campaign members. And so that's basically it. So you do a fast lookup, get your 22 records, process each one to create a new temporary record, add that to a new temporary table, and then Salesforce will, with a fast create, will do a bulk insert of those 22 records.
That's the bit of the magic I love. It's that
Yep.
You know, because the fast create then in a way becomes so straightforward, like you say. It's making Salesforce do the work, isn't it? Because each time with each of those records in the loop, you've created or collected together all the bits of information you need, haven't you, to create the record? Yeah, Laura, I'm glad you've gone back to this slide because Laurel loved it. She thought it was a really good slide. So there you go.
I like to visualize. It took me a while to understand what Salesforce was talking about when they were talking about S object collections and S object variables, until one day it just clicked and said, oh, they're talking about a temporary table and a temporary records. So you do your fast lookup, and it goes into a temporary table or S object collection, and then you pass. Your loop is going down one record at a time and passing it to an S object variable or a temporary record. And when that's been updated or created, you bring it back into a new temporary or new S object collection. And that new S object collection is what's acted upon by the fast create. So instead of creating one record at a time through all 22, it takes 22 records and does a bulk insert of those 22 records, or a bulk update if it was a fast update. So that's, I found visualizing it this way made a big difference for me.
So it's interesting. Yes, Laurel is, we're going back to Laurel's original question, and she's getting even a little more complex because she's wondering if you can put a decision point within the loop, essentially.
You can actually. So maybe say that campaign members was actually a volunteer list, and I only wanted to move over the people who I only wanted to move over my active volunteers. I didn't want to move over anybody who was now now an inactive volunteer. So I could put a decision point in and look at as I'm looping through. Just say decision point is what for that record. Is it a is the member status active or not? If it's active, then I'm going to move them over into the assignment. If not, I'll just skip.
So you don't necessarily need a second loop. It's just like as you're going through your first temporary table, you're just saying, is this true or not, before that value gets assigned. Is that right?
So yeah,
I could put the decision before the assignment. Yeah.
I could stick a decision here to say, is this record the member status active? If not, then it won't do anything. Otherwise, it's going to create a new record.
So are we getting towards answering your question, Laurel? She's either sort of. The problem is I need to loop through two things. Oh, okay.
I have done looping through two data sets. You have to be careful when you're doing that, because sometimes a loop within a loop, or creating records or updating records inside of a loop, will cause you to hit governor limits, basically a DML limit. So it's fine when you're just kind of doing one record or small record sets at a time, data sets at a time. But if you start hitting on something large, Salesforce is going to slap you on the wrist and say no.
Okay, Laurel's saying that her brain just hurts trying to figure out how to do it, because she's got to go through two sets of information to see if there are matches. I mean, can you create records out of one loop and just have those variables and then have a second loop? I don't know.
That's tough. Honestly, sometimes when you get that complicated, you're in the code.
Okay.
Now, I've done some complicated flows and sat back and realized by the time I finished it, it would have been cheaper to have a developer do it.
Okay. All right. Yes. And Laurel's saying I can just manually do the dupes, and they're smiling about that. So yes. Okay. But it's interesting. The challenge is a good one, isn't it? Okay. Does anyone, oh yeah, we have another quick question. We're just about to get to at the hour. Just from John, it says that the visual workflow guide recommends Safari, not recommended for visual workflow. Any real concern? Do any of you work in Safari with Flow and find it's okay? Or are you all Chrome users, or what do you?
Chrome or Firefox? Chrome
or Firefox. Yeah, I'm in Chrome, says Allison. Okay. Yeah, I think Chrome tends to give you, I don't know, there's a lot of it seems generally to be a little more developer friendly. Okay, any more quick questions from anybody? Otherwise, I will start wrapping up. But otherwise, thank you. Yes, thank you very much. I mean, we've kind of only begun, I think, to scratch the surface of something which is really kind of interesting, and you can get sort of very deep into this. But thank you very much for the panel. I think if nothing else, I hope what we've given you is some starting points and some ideas and some places that you can start to do your own investigation. And as people have said, there are lots of really good blogs about this and lots of documentation. So it's well worth reading. And please come back. And as John says, be brave, try the flows, and come back and share with us on the hub and let us know how you're doing, and we can try and troubleshoot. Thank you to those who've chipped in with the chat, particularly Russ Feldman. Thank you for picking up and answering some of those questions as we went along. Thank you very much indeed to our panel for the great demos and the really good introduction to this subject. That was a great session. Thank you very much. We'll be back with office hours next Friday, and we'll be back to our regular Q&A. So if you have any general questions, please come back and join the panel next week. But again, thank you very much to our panel and everyone for being here, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Caroline.